In this episode, we're going to take a look at Zurb Foundation, which is a front-end framework similar to Twitter Bootstrap, which I covered in episode 328. One major difference between the two is that Foundation is built upon Sass instead of Less, which can make it nicer to integrate into a Rails app. Well, let's try it out. First, I'm going to create a new Rails app from scratch. Let's call it Store. Alright, let's go into there. Next, I'll generate some scaffolding to give us something to work with. I'll make a product with a name and a price, and let's say skip style sheets, because we don't want it to generate the styles for this scaffolding since we're going to be using Foundation. And then I'll run the migrations. Now installing Foundation is really easy. Just go into the gem file and add the Zurb Foundation gem into there. In a Rails 3 app, add it to the assets group, and since there's no assets group in a Rails 4 app, just add it anywhere in the gem file. And of course, we'll run bundle to install the gem. And then to finish the setup, we'll run a generator provided by the gem called Foundation Install. And this will generate a few files for us. And because one of them is a layout file, it will ask us if we want to override the existing one. I'll say yes here, but if you have an existing app, you might want to copy off the contents of that before you run this so you don't lose anything. Now let's take a look at what was generated. The framework consists of both JavaScript and style sheets, so it'll need to add both to the asset pipeline, which it already did for us. If we check out the application.js file, we can see it requires Foundation here and adds this line to initialize the framework when the page loads. And then if we check out our application CSS file, this is a little bit different because it's requiring Foundation and overrides, which is a new file it generated right here. So this file will load in the Foundation framework and allow you to customize it by setting these variables. Now this file is really long because most of it's comments showing you what variables you can customize. And at the very bottom here is importing the Foundation framework. So you'll want to do any customization before the import happens. The last file that was generated is the layout file, which provides some nice defaults for changing behavior for old versions of Internet Explorer. You can configure a title by setting the title content, and it includes the JavaScript and CSS files as necessary. And here's what our application looks like. It's not too shabby, but we've got a ways to go. First of all, I'd like to add some structure to this page and include a sidebar with some About Us content on the right here. To do this, we'll need to understand Foundation's grid system. It's 12 column based, and we can define columns using CSS classes. We have a row and columns of various sizes, and those will be laid out on the page for us. So let's use this grid system to add a sidebar in our application layout file. One column I want to contain the body content, so this yield tag will go in there, and the other column will have an About Us section. So let's first define a div with the class of row. Then we need to define two divs in here, each with a class of, let's make a large, let's call it 8 and call it columns. And then we'll have a large 4, so that'll add up to 12. And then we can put our yield in there. And then for this div, let's just add maybe an h2 tag with an About Us section. And then we'll just toss some lorem ipsum in there. And reloading this page, and just like that we've got an About Us section on the side. Now I used large columns here, which means they're designed for a larger screen, and if I resize this window, then you can see that they all collapse onto a single column width, and that means so on mobile devices it will show like this. Now if you don't want this behavior, you can use these small columns instead, and this way it'll work the same across all sizes. Now if I reload the page, you can see we're back to 2 columns, even on smaller window sizes. Next, let's add a navigation bar to the top of the page, which Foundation makes really easy, even if you want to include nested menus like this. All you have to do is include some HTML with some classes defining the structure as shown here. Now there's a little bit too much HTML to write everything here on screen, so I'm just going to paste in something I prepared to add a menu to the top of this page. It just has some placeholder links and a title. And everything is structured like shown in the documentation, where we have various classes to define the different areas of the navigation. And let's check it out if I reload the page, and there's our navigation. It looks pretty good, but what if I want to customize it further, perhaps change the background color? And while we're at it, let's try customizing other things, such as the behavior of the columns, because right now they're a little bit too close to the edge. We can make these changes in the Foundation and Overrides SCSS file. Here you can see there are some variables for the top bar, including setting the color of the background. So let's uncomment this and change this background color, perhaps to something like a dark blue. So there are a lot of these variables here, and you can just use them to your heart's content to get Foundation to work just the way you want to. So near the top is where the grid variables are. Let's see, they're right here. And there are a few ways that we can handle the spacing. We could make the row width smaller, or we could change the column gutter. So that's about 30 pixels right now, so let's move this up to, let's just double it to 60 pixels and see how that looks. Reloading the page, and the page will take a little while to load because it's recompiling the SCSS. And then once it does that, you can see we've got a blue background here in the navbar, and the spacing is a little wider on the sides. Now there's a lot more that we can do with Foundation. A good overview is under the documentation under CSS components. There is a kitchen sink section which shows you some things you can do with styling, and you've got all kinds of things with alerts and buttons and embedded videos and just quite a few things here that Foundation can help you out with. And you can control all of this pretty much by specifying classes. So for example, if we want our H2 About Us section here to be a little lighter, we could add the class of subheader. And while we're at it, let's go into the index products page, and at the bottom here we have our new product link, and let's add a class in there to make this a button, and let's use the radius class as well to make the corners a little rounded. And reloading the page, and there are those changes. Now let's move on to creating a product because we've got our new product form here, which could use some improvement. Let's say I want this inline field look where the label is next to the field. And you can accomplish this in Foundation using the same grid system we used for the layout, because grid systems can be nested in Foundation. So here's what our scaffolded form partial currently looks like, and let's change this field div to be a row so it uses the grid system, and let's make a div with the class of, let's do small 3 for the label, and then we can move this in there. And to align it to the right, we can add a class for right and inline. And then for the field, I'll just add a div with the class of small 9 and columns. So let me copy and paste this for the price and rename these. And then for the actions div down here with the submit button, I'll also use the grid system here. And what's kind of cool is that you can do, so we can say small 9, but we can say small offset 3. So that way it's offset setting the label position, and then we can say columns here. Let's try that. And reloading the page, and it looks better, but it's not quite right because there's such a big gap here between the label and the field, and that's due to us setting the gutter to such a high pixel. Now if you don't want the gutters in a grid system, you can add the collapse class to the rows, but you'll probably want to add some spacing manually then, so I'm going to do that in a new style sheet. I'll make a new file here called layout.css.scss. And I'll just say label with the right class. We'll have a padding on the right of 10 pixels. Let's try that. And reloading this page, and it looks much better now. Now one more feature I want to show you here is tooltips, which are especially handy for forms. If I hover over a label, I might want more information about it. So let's do this for the price label. I'll put the text of the tooltip in a title attribute. So let's say price in US dollars. And then we can add a data attribute called tooltip. And let's set that to true. That's all. Now reloading our page and hovering over this, then we get the tooltip. Pretty cool. Now Foundation gives you a lot, but you might not end up using everything. So if there's some features that you don't use, you might want to remove those from the Foundation framework so that you're not sending that extra CSS or JavaScript code to the client if your application doesn't use it. And we can do that by expanding this import Foundation line out so that we can control exactly what is imported. To do this is actually quite simple. Just go to the Foundation project on GitHub, and under the SCSS directory we have our Foundation SCSS file, and we can copy the contents of this and just paste it inline on that page. So I'll paste this here, replacing the Foundation import, and this way I can remove exactly what I don't want to use in my application, perhaps the Joyride feature, so I can just remove that out here and I don't have to send that data to the client. We can do a similar thing for the JavaScript, and this is pretty interesting though because this is under a Foundation directory in a file called index.js. So this is a feature of Sprockets. If there's an index file, it will load that automatically if you're trying to require the directory. So we can copy these lines. And then in my application.js file, I'll replace the Foundation require line with those requires and format it properly. And so this way I can remove any features I want. So in this case, there's some Joyride related JavaScript. If I remove that feature, I can remove the JavaScript for that as well. Another thing you might want to do if you're trying to limit the amount of data you're sending to the client is replace jQuery with Zepto.js. It's quite a bit smaller, and Foundation fully supports Zepto, and it will just use this instead of jQuery if you have it loaded. Well, that wraps up this episode on Foundation. If you're trying to decide between Foundation or Twitter Bootstrap, they're both great frameworks and you can't really go wrong. I recommend you try them both out and see which one best fits your style. They are pretty similar. Well, thanks for watching. Last week at RailsConf, the first release candidate of Rails 4 was announced, so it's a great time to try upgrading to Rails 4 in your own projects. That way you can see if it works and report any bugs that you may come across. Now, I've already covered many of the new features of Rails 4 in episode 400, so in this episode we'll be focusing on the process of upgrading a Rails 3.2 app to Rails 4. This way you can follow along in your own applications. So the first step is to make sure you're on the latest version of Rails 3.2, and that all your gems are up to date as well. Also, you need to be on Ruby 193 or greater. Next, make sure that your test suite is fully passing. If you don't have any automated tests, then it's going to make the upgrade process a lot more difficult and require a lot of manual testing. So it's a good idea to maybe add some integration tests at this point if you don't have them. Looks like we're all passing in this application, so let's upgrade to Rails 4. I recommend doing this in a separate Git branch, so let's make a Rails 4 branch here. And next, going to the gem file, we can upgrade the version of Rails 4 from 3.2 to 4.0.0 RC1, or whatever the latest version of Rails 4 is for you. Now we'll need to change the versions of these other gems as well. Sass Rails is 4.0.0 RC1, Coffee Rails is just 4.0.0, and Uglifier gem I think is 1.3.0. Also, Rails 4 is doing away with the assets group, so you can remove this group block here. And I believe that the production environment will not try to dynamically generate any assets by default in Rails now, that it will just use the static precompiled assets. To go along with this change, the assets are now intended to be precompiled in the production environment, so if you are running this rake task to precompile the assets, make sure to set the Rails environment to production when doing so. A nice side effect of this change is that it simplifies the application config file. Before we had to load the gems matching the assets group, but only in development and test environments, so now we can just replace this code with a simple bundle require and loading the Rails environment group. Now, if you do miss the assets group in your production setup, you can certainly add something like that on your own and just customize that group loading behavior here. Now let's give this a try and run bundle update to install the new version. So this appeared to work successfully, but the bundle update command can sometimes have some unexpected behavior. To see this behavior, let's try running bundle outdated, which is a little known command, but it's pretty useful to find the gems which are out of date. So this only found 2 gems, Builder, and that's pretty close, but Papertrail, that version is way off, and that's because it tried to find a version compatible with Rails 4, which happened to be 1.6.4, and 2.7.1 relies on Rails 3. So we have some issues with the recent version of Papertrail. This is one reason it's important to be more strict on which version you want to accept. So our Papertrail gem here doesn't have any version specified, so let's make sure it's close to 2.7.1. And this time, when I run bundle update, I get this error message saying that there's a version conflict because Papertrail expects active record around version 3. So we're going to have to find a different version of Papertrail that's compatible with Rails 4. In this case, Papertrail has a Git branch for Rails 4 support, but this is going to change depending on the gem, and there likely will be other gems that you find are incompatible with Rails 4, so check out the issue tracker for each specific project to see what the status is. So let's change this version number to use the GitHub project and to use the Rails 4 branch. Now I'll try running bundle update again, and this time it'll fetch Papertrail through the GitHub project. And it looks like that worked. So now that we've got our gems up to date, let's try running our specs. and that fails miserably. So let's look at the error message here, and it looks like it's complaining about cache's page being undefined. So I am doing page caching in this app, which has actually been removed in Rails 4, along with many other things such as observers and protected model attributes and active resource. So if you need any of these features though, the good news is that you can easily add them back through gems. So going to the gem file, I'm just going to paste in a list of gems here, which I recommend adding during the upgrade process. And there are a couple of others you might want to add, such as active resource. But in this app, let's add these so that we don't get any errors that are related to these extractions. By the way, when you're doing a major version upgrade like this, I think it's important to get in a working state as quickly as possible, so try to avoid any large refactorings or big changes to the app, and these gems will help with that. And then when you get your test passing, you can clean up the code and maybe transition into other solutions which don't rely on these gems. So I'll run the bundle command to get those gems installed, and now let's try running our specs again to see if we can actually get them to run. And this time, nope, we get this exception. Now, we are going to see a lot of deprecation warnings at the top, but let's focus on whatever the stack trace is reporting, and that looks like it's complaining about the router because the match method is no longer accepted. So here's the router with the match method, and normally you'll just want to convert this to a GET request, but if you want to support other types, you could add them here, or if you want to support multiple types, you can add a via and then either an array of options or a via all to support any type of request. But here, let's just do a GET request. So let's try running our specs again, and they actually run this time, but there are a lot of failures, and this is complaining about mass assigning attributes for version, which is a model supplied by Papertrail. So this is now a gem that's expected to run in Rails 4 with strong parameters, but we're still using protected attributes. We can get around this issue by going to our application config file and adjusting this option that sets whitelist attributes to true, because that is going to expect @accessible to be defined in every model, which probably isn't going to be the case while you're transitioning to strong parameters. So let's just set this to false for now. Now let me try running the specs again, and they run and looks like they all pass. Yay! So this has a ton of deprecation warnings though, so let's kind of walk through these and try to debug them. Many of them have to do with configuration options such as whiny nils. This is no longer necessary. So I'm going to do this kind of quickly and walk you through the different configuration changes to get up to speed with Rails 4. So going under the development config file, we want to remove whiny nils, and instead we need to set eager loading in each of these environments. So eager loading set to false in development. And then we also need to just remove a few of these options that are no longer necessary for us to specify here. And then next we can configure production, and here we need to specify eager loading and set that to true. And the compress line changes to JS compressor, setting it to uglifier. And then under test we remove whiny nils here and set eager loading to false. And I'll also remove the mass assignment sanitizer because we'll be transitioning to strong parameters. Now a quick note about the asset pipeline. If we look in our application config file, we have this leftover option setting it to enabled. However, this is no longer necessary because in Rails 4 the asset pipeline is enabled by default, so you'll want to set it to false if you don't use the asset pipeline. If you do, you can just remove that config option. Now there's one more configuration change I want to make, and that is under the secret token initializer. In Rails 4, this configuration option has been renamed to secret key base. And you'll want to specify both secret token and secret key base while you're transitioning from Rails 3 to Rails 4. Once you've made that transition successfully, you can remove the secret token. Oh, and you'll probably want to use a different secret for the key base. So this transition is necessary because we're going from just a serialized cookie stored on the client side to an encrypted cookie. This prevents the user from easily being able to see the contents of the session cookie. Wow, so I made a lot of configuration changes here, but I didn't cover everything. So what I recommend doing is creating a new Rails 4 app, and then you can take a look at the generated config files and compare them with your own to see what else you might want to pull over. So with those changes, let's try running our specs again to make sure we didn't break anything and to see if we've dwindled down those deprecation notices. And we're still getting a lot of deprecations, but thankfully they're mostly duplicates. One of the deprecation warnings is inside this episode model, and that is whenever you're defining a named scope like we are here, you'll need to pass in a callable object as a second argument, like a lambda, for example. So we could do this instead. And that's necessary because it's very often to accidentally set something dynamic in here, such as the time, which we were doing before, and that was actually a bug because we don't want to set this to a time when the class is loaded. We want it to actually change every time this scope is called. Now the other deprecation is inside of this episode's controller. Here I'm calling episode find all by pro and setting that to false. So dynamic finder methods like this are no longer supported, so instead we can just change this to where the pro attribute is false, even more concise. And now when we run our specs again, it looks like they all pass with no deprecation warnings. Yay! Now that we've cleaned up the deprecations, we can focus on other transitions such as to strong parameters. So I covered strong parameters in episode 371, but we can do the transition quickly here. It's basically a way to move the mass assignment restrictions out of the model, so instead of at or accessible, we put them in the controller. So let's take these attributes here. And then going into the controller, let's define a private method down here at the bottom called episode params. This is just a conventional way to do it, but there are a variety of ways we could do it. Let's extract the episode parameters that are submitted through the form, and then call permit on this, and then pass in those same attributes into here that we had in our model. Now it's also a good idea to change these square brackets to a call to require. That way it ensures that that episode parameters hash is available, and it doesn't report a nil exception if it's not. Now we just need to use the episode params whenever we access the parameters that are submitted through the form. So whenever we're updating that episode or creating a new episode. There we go. So once we've done this everywhere in the app, we can go into the gem file and remove our protected attributes gem because it's no longer necessary. Oh, and you'll also want to remove any configuration options relating to that, such as in your application config file, we can clear out this whitelisted attributes config option. And running our specs, and they still pass. So we've got one of these gems down, and it might be a little bit tricky to transition away from these others. Rails observers, we could use callbacks instead, and page caching I think still has some really good use cases, so you might want to keep using that. Action caching, HTTP caching I think is a better alternative. Check out episode 321 for that. And I just found out that deprecated finders isn't necessary to mention here because it's already a dependency on Rails 4.0, and once 4.1 is released, then it will be removed. Now before I go, I want to mention a few other minor changes that you might want to make, and one is in the controllers. The before filters, you can now call them before action. There isn't a deprecation notice for before filter, but this is a little clearer, I think. And in the routes file, if you have any put-specific verbs, you can rename them to the patch verb because that seems to better fit the updating of a record. A couple other things, if you do have a test directory in your app, the structure has changed a little bit for that. Try creating a new Rails app to see the new structure. And also the vendor plugins directory is no longer used or accepted, so you can move plugins out either into a gem or into the lib directory. And that's about it. We've now successfully upgraded this application to Rails 4. Now there are many other Rails 4 features that I haven't covered here, but I have in past episodes, so be sure to check out the Rails 4 category to see those. And there are many other great resources mentioned in the blog post announcing the release candidate. Be sure to check those out. And that's all I have for this episode on upgrading to Rails 4. Thanks for watching.